Hey everyone, this is Miss Saunders here, and today we're going to be talking about logical fallacies. So, in this class so far, we've gone over logos and why it's important to use reason well in an argument, not just in terms of individual or micro appeals to reason, but also a line of reason that pushes throughout a text that is successful and linked and creates a cohesive, appealing argument to the reader. And that's important, right? So logical fallacies are times when the logic in an argument breaks down. There's a gap and a connection between different points, and it causes the reader to not believe what they're reading. And of course, you don't always catch that it's a logical fallacy, right? So ideally, learning about these logical fallacies will help us as, interpreters and viewers of media, that is social media, the news, newspaper articles, all the kind of media that we process. This will ideally make us better able to distinguish what we should believe versus what we should not believe, or we'll be able to have a better idea, ideally, of if something is a logical fallacy when it's happening before our eyes. So let's go over what is a logical fallacy. So a logical fallacy is a misuse of logical appeal in an argument. Misuse of logical appeal in an argument often results in a logical fallacy or faulty reasoning that breaks down the credibility of a claim. Now, oftentimes, if you're kind of going through a text slowly and thinking things through as each point comes, you'll often be able to tell when something is faulty reasoning because it just doesn't completely make sense, or it doesn't completely, appeal to you logically, probably because there's a gap in the reasoning somewhere. But today we're going to learn about specific different types of logical fallacies. So ideally this way you'll be able to not only kind of apprehend gaps or faulty reasoning, but you'll also know exactly what is the name of that type of gap or faulty reasoning. So we'll start off going over these 5, and then we'll go into a few more, but first I'll introduce them. So, and some of these have Latin names, just to kind of give you some background. So ad hominem, that's a personal attack. If some of you have Twitter accounts, which I'm sure a lot of you do, I feel like Twitter is home to the ad hominem logical fallacy. There's also straw person, which is misrepresenting a position and then dismissing as wrong. There's post hoc, which is kind of like faulty causation. So it's saying like, if one thing happened before another, then the first thing must have caused the second. Either or, making someone choose between 2 options as if there are only 2 options. And hasty generalizations, conclusion based on insufficient evidence. So let's go into ad hominem, personal attacks. So I have some examples of each of these fallacies here. Some of them are from the Purdue Owl website, which you guys have read this week, and some of them I kind of gleaned from various other internet sources, just to give you some variety. So I wanted you guys to have more than one example. So this is an attack, an ad hominem, on the character of a person rather than his or her opinions or arguments. Example. Greenpeace's strategies aren't effective because they are all dirty, lazy hippies. Another example is don't listen to Rush Limbaugh, he's a big fat idiot. So here we have, if this were to take place in the context of like, for instance, a political debate, a politician would be, instead of focusing on the merits of their opponent's arguments, they would, be attacking his ethos or his character, right? So while it's important to pay attention to ethos and characters when you're kind of analyzing argument, because obviously you want things to be coming from a credible source, it's kind of a logical fallacy if instead you choose to focus on insulting your opponent rather than attacking the merit or the structure of the argument itself. So the next one is a straw person. So this move oversimplifies an opponent's viewpoint and then attacks the hollow argument. So this, and let's just unpack this, I guess, metaphor, we could call it. So you know how there's a straw man who is meant to scare birds, predatory birds in a field by looking like a real person, right? It's a person, but it's actually stuffed with straw. So the comparison here is that you would be, if you were arguing with your opponent and you express your opponent's argument in a way that is oversimplified or reductive, or kind of just an untrue simplification or untrue characterization of what they're actually saying, and then you attack that hollow argument. It's kind of like attacking an argument that's full of straw, because it's not a real argument, it's an imaginary or a fake one. So it's kind of like the straw man doesn't have adequate defense because he's not a legitimate human. So here we go. Here are two examples of oversimplifications of an opponent's viewpoint and then attacking the hollow argument. So people who don't support this proposed state minimum wage increase hate the poor. And people who are for abortion like it's convenience, but this is human life we're talking about, and people need to be concerned with more than convenience. So in the first example, we're saying that they oversimplify the opponent's side by saying people who don't support the proposed state minimum wage increase hate the poor, when really actually there's probably a lot more nuance for reasons not to support this proposed state minimum wage. It could be bad for the economy, it could result in an increase in taxes, perhaps not all businesses can afford it, the margins of profit are already really slim. But here we have, you know, an oversimplification of the other side, and which makes it a lot easier to attack the other side if you kind of oversimplify what they're saying. So the second side, or the second example, are accusing people who like abortion because it's convenient, which again is an oversimplification of, and not an oversimplification, but also kind of an unfair way to characterize the argument as a whole, because people who are for abortion are oftentimes in support of women's rights, or people can choose not to have a child because they are victims of rape, or perhaps they choose to have an abortion because they found out that child will have some serious, you know, physical or mental defects that will ruin their lives. So to say that people like abortion because it's convenient, that's not an accurate characterization of the argument. But of course, it makes it very easy to attack that argument, that straw person, right? Because then the next point is made, but this is human life we're talking about, and people need to be more concerned with more than convenience. So hopefully this gives you, you know, we see this in the climate change argument debate that's happening, you know, online and in different news outlets. I see the straw person all the time. I see all of these all the time, if I'm honest, all of these logical fallacies. Okay, so post hoc ergo propter hoc. So this is a conclusion that assumes if A occurred after B, then B must have caused A. Example, I drank bottled water and now I am sick, so the water must have made me sick. Because I watched Friends last night, I passed my math test. We voted Democrats into office, and then the economy went downhill. So we see that these are examples that, yes, A did happen before B, but there's not, there isn't enough proof to show that that A necessitated B, or that there's a direct correlation. But it's very easy to think so if you present the information like that. And again, we see people making these kind of logical fallacies on the internet all the time, and in personal life as well. Now, if you really wanted to prove that the bottled water, let's look at the first example. If you really wanted to prove that the bottled water made you sick, you would have to kind of slow down and explain perhaps there's some more evidence that's missing there, right? And perhaps in a hypothetical situation that could be the case. But the way that the information is presented here, this is a logical fallacy because there's a gap in the reasoning. You know, just because one thing happened or another doesn't mean there's, you know, a direct correlation in causation. Either or, this is a conclusion that oversimplifies the argument by reducing it to only two sides or choices. And I mentioned how, you know, the climate change debate as a popular contemporary topic is something that we see this happening. So, example, you can either stop using cars or destroy the earth. Here's another one. Either you're for the Republican plan or you're socialist and un-American. So here we have, I guess this has in common, this has something in common with a straw person in the sense that it takes issues that are incredibly complex, lots of gray areas to explore, and basically makes it into two poles, the argument into two poles. You can either stop using cars or destroy the earth. And, you know, perhaps that we see, in a way, this makes me think of our political system, which is, you know, we basically have two main options. And sometimes it does feel like the choices are presented us as either stop using cars or destroy the earth, when actually there's a lot of a range, and there's a lot of, you know, for instance, you could start using green technology, or you could think of other little ways to save the earth as opposed to just stop using cars. So this is a conclusion that oversimplifies the argument by reducing it to only two sides or choices, and you feel like you have to choose one of them, even though the reasoning is wrong because it's ignoring the huge gray area and gaps in knowledge. So, and you see kind of a theme that we see running through these logical fallacies. They're very easy. They're quick. They're easy to digest, you know, and I guess it's ironic that we've talked about Twitter, because Twitter is of course an example of microblogging. So perhaps the reason why we see more of these kind of things, these logical fallacies happening on social media, is because there isn't a lot of time in an Instagram post or in a Twitter post to explore nuance, right? It's kind of, you know, one big splash and that's it. So as we're discussing these, what I'm kind of getting the impression of is that these are all very easy, and a logical fallacy is an easy way to try to kind of make an argument happen in your favor. Okay, so hasty generalization. This is a conclusion based on insufficient or biased evidence. In other words, you are rushing to a conclusion before you have all the relevant facts. Example, even though it's only the first day, I can tell this is going to be a boring course. So this is a faulty use of logic because it, again, rushes towards a conclusion. And a good, strong use of logos, you know, takes time. It has to kind of build its case and its appeal, or it's got to show strong facts grounded in, you know, actual evidence, as opposed to kind of coming to a swift conclusion after only a little bit of evidence. We see a lot of hasty generalizations on social media. Of course, in the time of the coronavirus, the global pandemic, a lot of the conclusions that we're coming to in the initial stages of the pandemic, they were all based on insufficient or biased evidence, because we literally had no evidence to go on because it was such a new disease. So as time has gone on, we've found out more, and we're continuing to find out more. But it's interesting to kind of think about this logical fallacy in terms of contemporary topics like climate change, but also COVID-19. Okay, three more to wrap up our logical fallacies. So the bandwagon appeal, if everyone's doing it, then it must be the right way or the right thing to do. When of course we know that plenty of people do things that are not the right way, not the right thing to do. So that's why it's kind of a gap in the reasoning. The slippery slope, a certain line of thinking will lead to more of the same. And genetic fallacies, this conclusion is based on an argument that the origins of a person, idea, institute, or theory determine its character, nature, or worth. So ad populum, this is at the bandwagon appeal. This is an appeal that presents what most people or a group of people think in order to persuade one to think the same way. Getting on the bandwagon is one such instance of an ad populum appeal. Example, if you were a true American, you would support the rights of people to choose whatever vehicle they want. So saying that, you know, if you want to be like everyone else in America, you should do things this way because that's what most people think, or a group of people think at least. And then our next example, I kind of went searching around on the internet for this, and I found one from Donald Trump at a rally. And I don't want you guys to think that this is any kind of commentary on my political stance, because I think that logical fallacies happen across the political aisle. But I thought that this one was applicable to this instance, to this specific type of logical fallacy. So he says, I only wish these cameras, because there's nothing as dishonest as the media, that I can tell you, Donald Trump has said at a rally. I only wish these cameras would spin around and show the kind of people that we have here, the numbers of people that we have. I just wish they'd for once do it. Now, to kind of back up what I'm saying, I actually have a video of him. Oh, got a lot of tabs open. Let's see. Okay. Have to get back on track here. So we see that we had the real life example, and as appeal that presents what most people think, or a group of people think, in order to persuade one to think the same way. Here Trump is saying at his rally that I wish these cameras would spin around and show how many people I have supporting me. I wish that they do it, and that's to kind of imply, look at all the support that I have. And I guess the implication is that other people should join him in support because he already has such a strong following. So in Slippery Slope, this is a conclusion based on the premise that if A happens, that eventually through a series of small steps, through B, C, X, Y, Z will happen too, and that basically that equates A and Z. So if we don't want Z to occur, A must not be allowed to occur either. So an example, if we ban Hummers because they are bad for the environment, eventually the government will ban all cars, so we should not ban Hummers. So we see how they're basically in this statement implying that if you do one thing, then it'll lead to, if you do A, then it'll lead to Z happening, and that's why you shouldn't have A. When really there's a flaw in that reasoning, right? Because banning Hummers does not necessarily mean that the government will ban all cars. That's conjecture, or that's speculation. It certainly could happen, but it doesn't mean that it definitely will. So to equate A and Z, or Hummers and banning all cars, that's a logical fallacy. That's slippery slope. So another one that I can think of is that people have made comments about, the Green New Deal, talking about how, which is, a deal that would make a lot of changes to American society in an attempt to make the climate, and to help climate change. And if people say, well, if you do the Green New Deal, then you might as well just shut down the American economy, or something like that. That's not an exact one, but I think that would be one example of equating, one possibility with that possibility drawn out to its most dramatic or exasperated conclusion. A conclusion which of course is speculative or conjecture. I don't know if you guys are kind of fans of ethics at all, but there's some ethical theories, called consequentialism, saying that, and there's a lot of debate talking about how if you do one thing, will it necessarily lead to a certain conclusion? And one side says that, of course, when you do a certain action, you can't think about how it's going to result in a number of subsequent actions. And there are other people who are saying, that's crazy. You never know what's going to happen for one thing. The number of outcomes are infinite, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a bit of a digression, but just kind of interesting to think about, you know, how one action will result inevitably in a number of subsequent actions, but how much can you really know about what will happen? Some things are certainly, you know, completely unexpected. The global pandemic, for instance. So our last quote, our last example of a logical fallacy. So this conclusion is based on an argument that the origins of a person, idea, institute, or theory determines its character, nature, or worth. And this is just a comment from me. A lot of racist and sexist statements come from these fallacies, as if a certain quality of a person kind of determines their, again, character, nature, or worth. But if you listen closely, these kind of fallacies actually have no scientific basis. For instance, an example is all women are bad drivers, as if to imply that all women, you know, lack the certain character, fortitude of character to be able to drive well, when in fact we know that statistically or in reality that is a complete mischaracterization of, you know, human nature and females in general. So again, unfortunately, in the world, this is one that we hear a lot, genetic fallacy, and that's why I wanted to end on that note today. So ideally now, so just to pause and think about these fallacies as a whole, if you were to encounter these and you were to be in a good frame of mind where you were able to pause and listen closely, say you saw these on social media or something, you'd be able to, just hearing them, you'd be able to stop and think, that doesn't really make sense if you try to connect one part of the thing to another, right? All women are bad drivers. Oh, but my mother is a really good driver. And oh, actually my father is not that good of a driver. So, you know, maybe this characterization doesn't make sense. So the important thing is to just get into the practice. And this is not just for this class, but just, you know, when you consume media in your daily lives, is to just try to get into the habit of pausing and spending some critical time with the stuff that you're ingesting. Today, ideally, should give you kind of some names to put on things and some ways, a framework to explore these things intellectually. But you yourself, probably without me having to tell you anything, I bet you would you'd be able to pause and realize that something that you're listening to is just not quite right. So that's, you know, my basic explanation of logical fallacies is that there's just a gap in the reasoning, and it just, on a certain level, it just doesn't make sense. Well, I hope that's helpful, and I hope, you know, we are able, you know, to not only use these in our, perhaps in our papers, and in our scholastic careers, but also just in when looking at your social media feed. Okay, I hope this is helpful. Have a great day, everyone.